Well, thank you all for coming to Cole's Thesis Defense, and we'll just let you take it away.
All right. So I'd like to start out this presentation with some brief acknowledgments. First, thanks to Megan Ward, my committee chair, for encouraging me to experiment and push the boundaries of what a thesis in an English department can be, and for patiently reading numerous drafts of the article component of this project. Teaching Intro to DH, the virtual collection, with you last quarter was a highlight of my time here at OSU, so thank you for that as well.
Mine too.
Next, and Evan Gottlieb, thank you both for serving on my committee and taking time to review my website and writing. I'm already on the lookout for the defense snake that Ray has snuck into this room, and I'm anticipating a custom distribution of Python. And to Eric Walkinshaw, I was hoping to find a GCR from computer science, but had no idea that I'd also be lucky enough to find someone that had a BA in English. Thanks for being here today. Besides my committee, I'd like to acknowledge Charles Robinson, my supervisor from the Division of Outreach and Engagement, and Ann Beatty and Corey Jackson, who I worked with last summer at OSU Libraries and Press. Thank you all for helping me create public engaged digital scholarship, which I think I've officially established as my MO. Thank you as well to everyone who has turned out to hear about the hybrid work that I have been doing and to support my well-known digital predilections. This is the first School of Writing, Literature, and Film thesis to follow the digital variant of the two-article option. So I feel obligated to briefly explain that. So in this model, there's one component, which is a digital project, one component, which is a traditional written article, and together those form a cohesive whole. So to reflect that cohesiveness, I'll be moving back and forth between those two parts today. I'll start by discussing the theoretical framework I developed in the article for thinking about humanities data as boutique rather than big. I'll then give an outline of the digital side of the project, Laboring Class Poets Online, or LCPO, which is a biographic and bibliographic database of 18th and 19th century British working class writers. I'll talk about the project's history, my role in developing it, and demo some aspects of the website. And then I'll finish by diving into the ways humanities data challenge a big data mindset through their complex representations of geography and events, and how boutique data can help us think through these areas better. Developing laboring class poets online and writing this thesis has been a recursive and reflexive process. My ideas about data within the humanities have been shaped by the web development and database work, and the underlying data model has in turn been shaped by those evolving ideas. Philip Ager describes this as a critical technical practice, a practice that actively reflects on its own philosophical underpinnings, and by incorporating humanistic and artistic knowledge approaches and techniques, opens up new technical directions. Because shifting between theory and building requires a split identity, Ager describes critical technical practice as a liminal, strange, and occasionally uncomfortable borderland. In respect to the gap from big to boutique data through laboring class poets online, I work from this hybrid space to argue that current understandings and implementations of databases designed with big data in mind often fail to meet the needs of humanities scholars. So I would guess that most MA students presenting theses over the past few weeks wouldn't describe their primary text as data. Or if they do, that wouldn't be your initial reaction. Most humanities researchers see their objects of study as contextually situated, socially constructed, interpretable entities with independent value, and would argue that these objects resist complete digital or quantitative representation. For humanities scholars, describing text as data can be uncomfortable. Miriam Posner writes that someone who calls a family album a data set isn't wrong per se, but that, quote, this person fundamentally doesn't understand why you value this artifact. She also argues that for many humanities researchers, describing an artifact as data is uncomfortable and implies that it exists in discrete, fungible units, that it's computationally tractable, that its meaningful qualities can be enumerated in a finite list, and that someone else performing the same operations on the same data will come up with the same results. Data defined this way clearly run counter to the interpretive and hermeneutic methodologies which form the core of humanistic inquiry. However, this is only one way to understand data. So this position stems from equating data with what I call a big data mindset. I explain this in more depth in the article, but big data is usually described through three main components. So it's high volume, often taking up petabytes or terabytes of space. It's high velocity, in that it's automatically generated by sensors like website clicks or Internet of Things devices, and it can lose value quickly if it's not processed in real time. And it's of heterogeneous variety in that it's collected from a variety of sources and files. These qualities, especially the high volume of big data, create the illusion that such data sets can perfectly model an imperfect and unpredictable world, gaining credibility simply by increasing in volume. The computational authority of big data is persuasive and seemingly presents an entirely new way of knowing reality. And I want to say that I don't fundamentally oppose big data or the digital methodologies used to process it. However, I do reject understanding data solely through what I call a big data mindset that excludes smaller, manually created information by implying that only large, recent, and complete data sets are useful. So with this in mind, I introduce the concept of boutique data. I first heard boutique used to describe data several years ago during a conversation with Katie Osborne, a PhD candidate at Notre Dame and former member of the LCPO team. She was trying to obtain digital infrastructure and IT support from the library there, and she had a conversation with one of the librarians who called the project too small and boutique for the services they provided. It was a project that they didn't know how to support. So in this context, boutique was used pejoratively to frame small databases as undeserving of institutional support. I encountered boutique data again in an article by computers and composition theorists Cheryl Ball, Therese Graben, and Michelle Silder. They describe boutique data as small, local, and dark, or inaccessible. And they primarily address collaborative data creation and open access, which I don't focus on. Instead, I'm really appropriating their term and their positive framing to describe what an approach to database work. So what is or are boutique data? In my article, I frame boutique data as both a thing, a boutique database or data set, and a theoretical approach to data-driven work. In most cases, a boutique approach to data is at odds with the big data mindset. These are some of the characteristics that I use to describe boutique data. So where big data are automatically generated, boutique data are often manually created and curated, and a boutique data approach explicitly acknowledges the hidden labor of data creation and cleaning that shapes data sets. A big data mindset equates size with usefulness because it's only interested in the aggregate, where a boutique approach recognizes that with a smaller data set, individual records can also be analyzed alongside the whole as researchers shuttle back and forth between close and distant methodologies. A big data mindset fits data into a predetermined mold, while a boutique approach to data builds a data model from the bottom up. And finally, a big data mindset emphasizes completeness, and thus sees gaps as bugs, while a boutique approach to data invites users to see gaps not as empty voids, but as evocative absences worth further investigation. These absences, whether they occur because of missing information or non-numbers, are often the most interesting aspects of data sets for humanities researchers. So I examined the concept of boutique data through the digital component of this project, Laboring Class Poets Online, using that as a case study. So LCPO is a website that aggregates biographic and bibliographic information about laboring class poets who lived in the British Isles or colonies and published between 1700 and 1900. And it thereby helps demonstrate the importance of working class writing to social and literary history. While Laboring Class Poets is a digital resource, it draws on a long history of collaborative textual and archival scholarship that began over 30 years ago when Dr. John Goodridge began creating a list of underappreciated non-canonical poets. Goodridge later narrowed this list to focus solely on laboring class figures, and in 2001 released the first version of the super list with 659 poets and a concise paragraph on each individual. As of last month, this resource includes over 2,000 poet entries, and Goodridge continues to add more. And the growth of the super list over those intervening years and how people have used it has made it apparent that the list's form, like a long, static Microsoft Word document, doesn't match its intended function as a reference tool. It's really a database trapped in a narrative, and that structure was limiting its potential audience and usability. Transforming the superlist into that database has been a circuitous process. Goodrich and Tim Burke at Nottingham Trent first attempted this in 2005, but quickly ran into technical difficulties and never produced a functional prototype. And in 2012, as an undergrad at Creighton, I began working on the current transition with several other undergrad and MA students under the direction of Bridget Keegan. We began cataloging poet records in Excel, and while we created a project blog and looked at several digital platforms, including Omeka, FileMaker Pro, and even custom development, we never went beyond a test site because our data model wasn't fully fleshed out. So this was the state of the project when I began developing Laboring Class Poets Online last year. So as I've mentioned, this is a highly collaborative project, which is typical of digital humanities work. And we have collaborators that are spread across the globe. There's an academic advisory board, several subject area editors, and some of these people have sent information, some of them have helped write full records, and I've performed all of these roles at different times. My biggest contribution has been developing the website and database that houses all of this information. So this is our homepage. As I mentioned, we're mostly looking at poets and their publications, so those are our main content types, poets, publications. And the other content types here, so non-poet figures, relationships, publishers, periodicals, major sources, and collections of content. So there's a random poet, random publication, these change every time that someone hits the homepage, and then a poet in need, if you're logged in. And a poet in need is one that hasn't gone through the entire publication process yet. So there's data entry, verification against the superlist, additional research, and then publication. So it's kind of an abbreviated peer review process. So these are figures that haven't gone through that entire process yet. The front page also includes collections of content for analysis that can be created by users and blog posts by the project team. So if we go to the poets table here, we can begin to see why taking the time to structure all this information is necessary. We can use a faceted search to drill down into the database itself. So here I've preloaded a search for all Scottish poets who worked in the textile industry before 1800. Those are the kind of levels of search that you can get to. You can go and click through to individual poet entries. So this is Robert Tannahill, who I'll follow briefly. He was one of the most prominent weaver poets from Paisley, which is a town outside of Glasgow, that also is famous for the Paisley tie pattern, fabric pattern. And these individual poet pages allow you to see detailed biographic information. So we capture a lot of project-specific data that wouldn't fit within a typical metadata scheme, like immigration, class status, education levels, when poets began working, and interactions with the criminal justice or social relief systems. You can also see publications here, and many of these have been digitized online, and we link out to those where possible. In the publications, we capture things like the cost of publication, whether there was a subscription list, whether poets wrote in dialect, whether there was a patron for the work. So very specific things to this kind of research that wouldn't be included in other sources. There's a map of locations where poets lived. So Tannahill mostly stayed within Scotland, but many other Scottish and Irish poets were transatlantic and immigrated back and forth. And we capture relationships. So when poets interacted with other poets or non-poet figures, whether through collaboration or writing back and forth, citing each other in works. And that's useful here, but it becomes more useful when we zoom out. So this is a network graph of all of those relationships between poets. You can start to see clusters of influence. So this is Robert Burns, James Hogg, Ebenezer Elliott. These are all major figures in the class writing tradition. Tannahill's down here, and these are all minor Paisley poets that he interacted with. And this is all colored by nationality, so you can start to see that Scottish poets in blue tended to interact with other Scottish poets. English poets in black mostly worked with other English poets, and Welsh poets in red were kind of off on their own, disconnected from this larger tradition of laboring class writing. So you can also go through and do things like search for a specific person. Get that there. You can even go through and add back in all of the nodes. It's probably really hard to see. Oh no, you can't see them. So these are all the other poets that don't have relationship data that we've captured yet. So the kind of gaps that are between what we have and what we don't have. And I've created a lot of other interfaces for this data that I don't have time to share here today, but you can see them under the Visualizations tab here. So while I've tried to apply a boutique data approach to the development of laboring class poets online, the article examines just as many of my failures as my successes and speculates about the possible future improvements for the project. I structured the second half of my article around two broad ways that a big data mindset conflicts with boutique approaches to data, through representations of geography and chronology, and I introduce eventfulness as a possible way to move boutique databases forward. So geography. Accurately representing historical places turned out to be really difficult using standard database technologies. There are a lot of GIS tools that can geocode location names by turning them into a set of latitude and longitude coordinates, but few off-the-shelf services like Google Maps play well with historical information and places. So of the over 1,300 locations used by LTGO, I had to go through and manually geocode about 300 of those. Because GISs fail on variant spellings, historical places that have since been abandoned, and hyperlocal locations. Going through and capturing these locations isn't just a matter of accurately quantifying a physical place. A boutique approach to data engages with geography as an organizing force that is tied to cultural heritage and belonging, and cannot be reduced to just those coordinates. So for laboring class writers, place strongly influenced their writing communities. These literary communities had distinct identities that shaped the topics that poets wrote about, the dialects they used, the ways that they published, and the forms their writing assumed, all of which I examined more closely in the full article. And this is some of those relationships and communities. So while there were a few transatlantic tides that skewed the mean pretty high, the average distance between poets was only 43 miles. So you can see that they really were most closely tied to their local communities. Some of these writing communities have endured long after the poets themselves have passed away. So the tradition of songwriting, started by Tyneside figures like Tommy Armstrong, Ned Corvin, Joseph Skipsey, the Pitman poet, that continues today with events like the 2014 Festival of Mining Literature and Poetry in Northeast England. Yet the places that these poets knew have changed significantly in the intervening century since their deaths. So Newcastle upon Tyne here used to be a part of the historic county Northumberland, and Gateshead, just a little further south, used to be part of the historic county Durham. But today those have largely merged to form this new county here, Tyne and Ware. And such changes upset historical geography, and places begin to assume quotidian governmental functions rather than acting as unifying cultural forces. So altering spatial boundaries in this way doesn't just modify political constituencies or trade systems, it profoundly influences communities of writers and citizens whose identities are bound to the land. Groups such as the Association of British Counties advocate for returning to the older historic county system. And they argue that the historic counties are, quote, bedrocks of the history, culture, and geography of Britain, places where people live and come from, where they belong. So the ABC is following a boutique approach to spatial data by treating locations like the cultural entities they are, rather than a set of boundaries. Another force that poses problems for databases is the humanities formulation of chronology. So most computers measure time as discrete units elapsed since a fixed origin, typically milliseconds since the Unix epoch in 1970. And databases thus enforce an ontological understanding of time as a linear and fully measurable force. So time is essentially a stopwatch for triggering processes, with every single tick holding the exact same significance. In contrast, humans understand time and time duration subjectively, and many of our historical systems for measuring time reflect that ambiguity. I don't have time to discuss all of those today, but in the full version of my thesis, I look at several of those systems and use Wai-Chi Dinok's concept of deep time to explore why a boutique approach to data is more effective than a big data mindset when trying to represent historical, non-standard, partial, or fuzzy chronologies. So LCPO uses fuzzy chronologies to approximate when poets lived and published. So while birth and death years are clearly the best way to establish a lifespan, when those aren't available, we use baptism dates. We also use circa fields to indicate when there is a degree of uncertainty attached to a date. And because we have publication data for most poets, we have another field which captures a date or date range for when poets were actively publishing. So Thomas McQueen, a Scottish poet from Barkett, published 3 collections between 1826 and 1836, and that gives us a flourished range of that same date. So these chronologic and geographic gaps shouldn't be construed solely as a lack of information. So while there are missing pieces which will eventually be added as additional research is completed, there are also holes which will never be filled. These nulls do not corrupt the database, but accurately represent the ruthlessness of the historical record and the passage of time. Many laboring class figures left few lasting traces: a name, a few dates, maybe your birthplace or an occupation, maybe a few chapbooks or collections. And many of these publications have not survived, so I've never been able to track down this. It's only been referenced in other works. And small print runs, marginal venues, cheap ink and paper, and stereotypes of laboring class writing as not valuable or literary and thus unworthy of preservation have all contributed to their deterioration and loss. A boutique approach to data, therefore, seizes on these gaps as instances where class, the literary marketplace, and time intersect, and tries to make these fractures in historical record visible. Events emerge from the overlap of these two organizing forces, geography and chronology, and those occur when human or non-human actions are stitched into a folding of time and space. Humans often perceive events as things that occurred in a fragment of linear time in a specific physical place and are circumscribed and frozen by those boundaries. So Derrida introduces the concept of arrivance, which resists such a simple understanding of events. He writes that, quote, an event that remains an event is an arrival, an absolute arrival or arrivance. It surprises and resists analysis. So as continuously developing assemblages of time, place, and action, absolute events are irreducible and cannot be fully exhausted. Given the difficulty of properly representing geographic and chronologic humanities data from a big data perspective, creating eventful databases provides a way to deploy a boutique approach to data. And LCPO doesn't currently do this very well, in my opinion. Most of the biographical data goes into fields using controlled vocabularies, but this approach is somewhat static and one-dimensional because it doesn't fully capture those time and space aspects or the potential gaps and uncertainty. For example, when we list a poet's occupation, that's all that we have, a list of occupations that you can search and filter. Instead, we could structure poet lives as a series of events. So birth events, marriage events, occupation events, death events. And rather than listing a poet's occupation as a silk weaver or a miner or a haberdasher, treating that as a standalone event with a place, time range, description, and a degree of certainty attached to all those elements would be much more useful. So decoupling biographical data from content type fields in this way and imbuing it with time and space would make eventfulness a guiding paradigm for LCPO. Users will be able to see via time maps how poets move between locations or remain local. And those benefits won't be limited to single poets. It would be possible to pull events from the lives of many different writers, filter them by any number of criteria, and recombine those in a new timeline or map. An eventful approach thus alters the very function of time within the database. Rather than serving as a unidirectional force that emphasizes temporal difference, time begins to fold events together as they are combined and restructured in new ways. So moving forward, boutique databases present an opportunity to advance digital scholarship at any scale by minding the gaps, small size, incompleteness, and messy fuzziness of historical and humanities information. In an increasingly digital world, a boutique approach to data emphasizes the strengths of humanistic interpretation while incorporating new digital methodologies. Understanding humanities data from this perspective allows us to ask new questions rather than circumscribe possibilities, and is in the gaps that boutique approaches to data hold the greatest potential. Thanks.
We have time for a few questions.
Okay, so I just want to say first that this was great, and I really appreciated your presentation. So I think your framework of like the boutique approach to data is really interesting, and like kind of my connection to it is like the Shoah Foundation, which is compiling like survivor testimonies
From the Holocaust? Yeah,
Yeah,
I've heard of that as well.
Yeah, and so I think a lot of what you have to say like can apply to that. So a lot of those are like actively encouraged to be like used in the classroom, and so I'm wondering, especially because it's an overwhelming amount of data, like what do you see as like pedagogical applications? Because like it seems like the goal of digital humanities is to be public and like accessible, and not just like, you know, doing it for the sake of doing it, right? Like it has a public orientation. And so I'm interested if you thought about like maybe classroom applications, or like what are some ways that the public could utilize this database?
So I guess I'll start with a little anecdote from the DH class that I worked with Megan on last term. So when we were looking at students' final projects, we had one student who said that she worked way harder on her digital project simply because it was public in that way. So compared to a paper that you churn into your professor or instructor, you maybe get some feedback on, and then it dies, it goes away, it never gets looked at again. Digital projects have like an afterlife. They continue to live for a very long time. So this student emphasized that she put more work in because she knew that it was public, that other people would be looking at this. Maybe she would send it off to potential employers to say, look, I can make digital things. And I guess I'm working with one of the people on the project team, Bill Christmas at San Francisco State University. He runs this project called Poetical Scavengers with his undergrad classes. So they go through and create digital editions of different working class texts. And he's thinking about using this project next spring, Labor and Class Poets Online, with one of his master's courses there. So to have students go through and actually contribute information to the database, go through, write an expanded entry for different poets, do a deep dive into kind of the archival or digital archaeology, and recover some information. So those are, I guess, two ways that I look at digital pedagogy and ways that this can be applied. Yeah.
This is really amazing. Thank you so much. I know very little about DH, so I'm just going to run with this question. But I'm kind of wondering how embracing messy, or not messy, but gassing data or fuzzy data, like you talked about, how that might create conflict or debate among scholars, and how it's ultimately decided, like, this is the data that we're going to go with, or this is the fact or the date, or et cetera, that we are going to go with, especially if that data is contested in some way, or if there is a gap, and kind of how to deal with that.
Yeah. So actually finding a fixed point, I mean, that's a question for historians that I don't really want to get into. But a lot of the time you do, especially with older, like classical information, you probably have a range of dates rather than 73 AD. So I guess from a digital perspective of building this, you can build that kind of uncertainty into your data model. So you say that there's a range of possible dates, and as a point, you represent it as a range. Or with geography, rather than a point, you represent it as a polygon, so a space rather than a single, really finite point. Is that kind of?
Totally, yeah. Can I have on to the question?
Yeah.
So I know in the past you've talked about not translation, but like punctuation, like cleaning up translation or like publications of those poets. Like, are those also accessible on there so people can see like the different kinds of like ways that those things are published and maybe like draw conclusions about them?
Yeah, so we don't host primary texts. We host kind of the metadata records for different texts, and then we link out to other digital editions where they're available. But long-term, down the road, that is something we want to get into, is actually hosting primary texts. And we just applied for an ACLS grant that we didn't get because they're very competitive, but that was one of the things that we had talked about potentially implementing through that grant like that. Yeah.
So thank you for amazing presentation. I've learned a lot from watching you and from listening to your presentation. In your conclusion, you tell us to mind the gap, and I was kind of curious if there is a way for us to mind the gap. Do you prioritize certain kinds of gaps over other gaps? And like, what would be the reasons you would prioritize certain gaps over others?
Well, I guess one way to look at that question would be to examine this from in terms of the canon. So for a long time, these kind of poets just simply weren't part of what we consider the literary canon. And I mean, you have the canon wars where different minoritarian writing has been added and then emphasized at different points. And I guess this is kind of a reclamation project in some ways, because information about all of these different writers up until very recently, it just didn't exist anywhere, or there's no central point to kind of gather all this information. So this kind of starts to fill in those gaps in terms of later in class literary history.
Is that it? Okay, well, I guess we'll conclude the public portion. Thank you.